Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Parenting is Easy podcast, where we will discuss the pleasures and the frustrations, the good and the bad, and the rewarding and the troubling aspects of parenting. I am your host, Chananya Abraham, and I'm a psychotherapist that specializes in working with teenagers, young adults, and parents with a specific niche in assisting with communication within the family dynamics. While everyone has their own unique journey and experiences as a parent and as a child, there are many common affiliations and attributes that we can all relate to and share. Together, we will learn from personal stories and experiences from parents across many different backgrounds, cultures, and communities. So get comfortable, grab your glass of coffee, and let's get right into the interview. So, thank you so much for joining us again on another episode of Parenting is Easy, Said No Never. I am your host, Chananya Abraham, and I am joined by an amazing guest today, Andy Heller, who is going to share with us some advice coming from a dad's point of view and from his own experience dealing with a specific issue that we have not had a chance to talk about here yet. But just a little bit about Andy first. Andy has put out, co-authored, 2 books in the real estate investment area and was really done with writing books. But through his own experience going through a divorce and reading countless support books, seeing that there was a hole and a niche that needed to be filled when it came to writing a book. And through his own experience, writing a book called Take the High Road, Divorce with Compassion for Yourself and Your Family, which is something that we'll be talking about today. But without further ado, Andy, thank you so much for joining us.
Chananya, thank you for having me. I'm excited for the podcast, and let's see if we can hopefully give some people some great counsel.
Yeah, okay, so just getting right into it over here, this topic of divorce and the big impact that it has on parenting. I'm curious to hear, when those words are said to you, what's the first thing that comes to mind on your experience, on how you were able to relate to this topic and how it resonates with you and how it impacted your relationship with your kids?
Well, I think I'm going to answer your question with a really short story, which actually became my impetus for writing this book. So in my group of friends, Chanaya, I am that reasonable guy that people goes to solve problems. I'm the village elder. So, because I think of both sides, I try to separate emotion, and I've always been that way. And it's a wonderful skill to help me run businesses successfully. But my own divorce was challenging, and I had this. We had a co-parent counselor. It was a high conflict divorce, and the co-parent counselor said to me and my ex, "You guys could really use a therapist." So I said, "Oh, can't hurt." So I said, "Well, give me the couple names of therapists who particularly have done work with divorced men, all right? Because I need somebody who can guide me." And I got this great therapist. She was amazing. And again, I'm that reasonable guy, everybody. So we had a number of sessions. And the other thing about everybody has a different coping process for stress. For me, I don't sleep a lot, which is why I read so many other books about divorce. And so I saw this niche, and I take notes. So I'm writing all the stuff that's happened. I'm just writing, okay? Like when my mom was passing away in hospice, my notes became an article that got covered in 5 newspapers in the Mother's Day after she passed. So something happened with my ex, and she asked me well, what do you want to do? And I said, I'll get back to you. Why? Because I had a session with my therapist, and I was going to run him. I knew exactly what I was going to do, but I wanted to run it by her. So I go into the session, Shania, I was confident. I said, this is what happened, but don't worry, I've thought it through, and this is what I'm going to do. So she went all into the therapy speak. Well, Andy, I'm glad you feel that way, blah, 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 but you're not going to do what you just said. You're going to do the opposite. And here's why. And I'm like, what? She's like, Andy, listen to me. So she went out, and basically the advice that came out of her mouth, Shania, was the opposite of what I intended to do. And when I allowed her to speak and frame and put the basis behind her counsel, I'm like, oh my God, you're 100% right. So the big picture point that I left that session with is, again, I'm a pretty reasonable guy. I'm not that guy that was getting divorced and said, I wanna really punish my ex, all right? I was doing a good job of managing my anger, and 'cause, we have different emotions. It's when good people act their worst is what they say about divorce, and I thought I was handling it really well, but what I left that session with was an amazing observation. I realized the degree at which I was emotionally compromised and unable to make optimal decisions.
Mhm.
Because she was right and I was wrong. So I looked at my notes at that point. I'm like, oh my God, I got an outline here for a book. And I started 6 years of research, which became the book that we'll talk about later on today. But the big picture for parents is when you're going through a divorce, and this is why you need to seek out somebody like Shania and this podcast, read a book like mine. We don't have the capacity to measure the degree to which we are not operating optimally. And because of that, we're not as good parents, we're not as good friends, we're not doing our jobs as well. And it tends to affect every part of our life, but the most important part is of course, our ability to parent effectively. And this is why you need somebody else in your ear, be it a good book like mine, a great therapist, um, to help you navigate through these times so you can make the best possible decisions until you reach a point where, and it will happen, where the angst, the anger, the hurt, the pain, it will begin to dissipate. But for some, it's a year, for some, it's 4 or 5 years. It almost always does, which is the good thing, but until it does, guys and gals, we need help. And don't be so proud and say, "Hey, I'm Andy, and I don't need any help. I'm a reasonable thinking guy." You know what? I did need help, and the best thing that I did was seek out somebody. And the one thing, last thing I'm gonna say before I pass the baton back to you is that, um, the people to give you help are not people in your world because they love you and their advice is jaded, and it should be jaded. You've gotta find somebody like a therapist who can look at you and say, "I love you, but this is what you need to do. Your plan was wrong."
Right. I love
So
that.
anyhow, that's
I
yeah.
love that. I think that goes a very long way. There's so many things to unpack there, Andy, as you were talking. To be honest, one of the first things that came up to me is I think you being receptive and saying, "Hey, you know what? Let me try something." A concept we talk about here in this podcast a lot is from a mentor of mine, Bessel van der Kolk, that talks about ABC, always be curious. And I think it's the day that we stop being curious is the day we stop learning. And in some ways, that could be the end of our lives in many ways. So that concept of you being able to just be open and saying, "Let me try something," I think really was more than just the seed being planted for this journey, but it's also started to sprout something as well, which I think is absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, and I think it helped. I will say this, that the the lady who gave the suggestion was our co-parent counselor. I respected her. I trusted her, and clearly she had context because she had met with me and my ex a number of times.
Right.
She was hearing the drama. I was like, "Okay," and this person is getting to know me. She sees that I'm a pretty reasonable guy. I'm not out to try to hurt my ex. And I trusted her advice that I could benefit from it, and that helped.
Right.
But you're right, not everybody's gonna have that co-parent counselor who tells them you really need a third party. And this is actually one of the chapters in my book. Where are you gonna get your counsel from? And it I specifically talk about the need to not go within your circle of friends and family. That's the wrong place to go, and it's the first place that many of us go for support. They can give you support. They can't give you advice because their advice is not grounded.
Right. Very, very well said. And I think really good family will even say, listen, I'm here for your support, but for advice, let's go to a professional. And I think that's the
Yep.
sign of someone that is really close to you and really wants the best for you and going to the right person. And like you said, having someone that's able to give the right advice in that counselor, and then you being receptive to it, and then finding the right person, even finding the right therapist sometimes can be a real trip for people. It can be really, really difficult. And finding, the way I like saying it, and it's on my website, finding the right therapist for you is like finding a house, a spouse, or a pair of shoes. And sometimes you have to try on a few to find the one that works for you. And I think that applies to whether it's for children or whether it's for ourselves, whether it's through someone going through a divorce or something else. It's always important to know what it is that you're looking for and find the right person for you. The other thing that really stood out for me, and there are so many questions I want to get into here on this topic, is this therapist, and I'm so happy that you were able to have an opportunity to learn and grow from her, and in many ways she was the start of the inspiration for this book. At the same time, I also believe that therapists job and their role is to be there for the client and guide them and not tell them. So the fact that she was being gutsy and telling you, "Oh, Andy, you're not going to do this, you're going to do this," is a very gutsy move, and not one that a lot of therapists would do. But I think every person has the right therapist for them, and not every therapist is for every person. So fortunate you were able to find the one that works for you, that you're able to go ahead and do that on this approach. And I want to go back to specifically this point of the co-parenting, when you have two different households that are literally just that, two different households, and every household does things differently, whether it's from the way they eat, dress, act, their morals, their political beliefs, maybe their cultural and religious beliefs as well. What are some tips that you can sort of educate us with when it comes to the concept of co-parenting within two different households?
Oh my God. Well, that probably is 60% of my book. My book is not just about divorce. It's about that sometimes 10 years that you have to spend connected, finishing raising these children. And that's so 60% of my book, I think, begins after the divorce. So I can give you some great and simple tips right now. One is try to come up with similar chores and house rules in both homes. It's not very easy to do. Kids need that consistency. Um, on custodial time swaps. So most divorces have a custodial calendar, and there'll be a structure to it: week on, week off, 5-5-2 structure, whatever. But the structure is set up before in advance. So life intervenes, and Aunt Sally's coming from North Dakota, and you want to visit Aunt Sally, but it's on his time. Um, so always, always, always agree to a custodial swap if it's in the kid's interest, even if you're not getting similar love and action in return.
Right.
Um, Another great tip, and and this is actually really powerful. So I think every divorce book you read will say, "Don't criticize your ex." All right, and that's the right advice, and that advice is also in my book. But in my book, what I did, Shania, is I interviewed field experts, and I basically took my book is more like a businessman's best practices of how to get through a divorce
Mm.
without as healthy as possible without screwing up your kids. All right. So I take these advices not about Andy Heller's divorce. In fact, my name is not mentioned anywhere. I just organize these advice from the experts who really know what they're doing into how to negotiate a fair divorce, get it over as fast as possible, and land and co-parent in a manner that is healthy as possible. So I'm doing all these interviews, and the topic of criticizing the ex was I was interviewing a therapist, and she said something that was probably one of the two or three most powerful lessons, observations, or comments that I think went into my book. So again, everybody has all said for years, don't bash your ex. But what she said was powerful. She said, the children as young as 4 or 5, they understand one thing intuitively. that they are the byproduct of the DNA of two people, a biological mom and a biological father. Okay. And assuming you're in a traditional household where the two parents that are splitting up are the biological mom and biological dad, when one parent criticizes the other parent, the child processes it as self-criticism because they know that 50% of their DNA is the person who's being bashed. So the point to take away there, ladies and gentlemen, is not only should you not criticize your ex because it's the right thing to do, but you should not criticize your ex because it's affecting your child's self-esteem. And that was like an absolute Shazam, wow, holy smokes moment for me. And that was one of the most powerful observations that went into my book that I was completely floored when I heard that, Shania.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely amazing point, and obviously, I think that applies to married couples as well because it's
Yes.
still the same DNA, and never
Yeah.
criticizing each other in front of the children or behind the other spouse's back. I think goes a very very long
Yep.
way because. Yeah, you're right. It's part of the child's DNA, and when you are going to put down or say something to the child, it's automatically affecting them. And I think that's really,
Yeah.
really, really helpful. And on that point, and we talk about the children here being the focus and what the role of the parent is when it comes to the children. I'm hearing you talk about taking care of the child's well-being during the divorce. What other advice would you talk about when we think of? I guess you could say, and not to say specifically this, but I guess to use the words of a child-centered approach when it comes to the parenting aspect of and things that we should be focusing on, the parents should be focusing on when it comes to their children in a divorce.
Well, uh, I'm going to start with, I think the most important is that one of the comments that I spoken about, I wrote in the book that was, again, the other thing I did was I interviewed divorcees who have since landed in, who had high conflict divorces, who landed in healthy places. Okay. What do you do right? What do you do wrong? Tell me about your divorce. Any advice, blah, blah, blah. And one of the most powerful things I ever heard was, um, the we adults will eventually land okay, but the child never recovers from a parent's divorce. And that was so depressing, to be perfectly honest with you, to hear that. And again, a therapist may have a different take on this. This was just not a therapist, it was a guy, but it got me thinking. And the what we need to do, starting with the most important thing, is observe our children for behavioral changes. All right. Now, one of the things that's sprinkled all over my book is the need to put your children in therapy. And we discussed different types of child therapy. Why? You've got your own drama to deal with. You're not qualified as a parent to be an advocate for your child without separating your own drama. So, point number one, the best thing you can do is get your kids in therapy and force them. Sorry, Johnny, you want to play soccer? You got to do this once a week. All right. Susie, you want that great dollhouse? Fine. Here's a therapist. Now, there are different types of therapists for different age kids. Like there's something called play therapy for young kids, where kids can communicate how healthy and how they're managing the challenges through play. But look for behavioral changes. And as kids get older, changes in grades. Make sure you're watching social media. Okay. Changes in friends. All right. Unique smells when you go into the rooms. um, Behavioral changes typically are the cry for help that something's going on. All right. And you've got to act on that. And this is why the child therapist is so important, is that if you are dealing with a lot of drama yourself, it could also just be the pressures of trying to reinvent your life. because in a one household environment, there are typically roles, Chanaya. So, I had a kind of a old fashioned household where I had a stay at home wife, and I basically had a couple of jobs, and I was a breadwinner. Okay, my ex was a great cook, very good homemaker. I could cook one or two things without burning the kitchen, um, but I was a great breadwinner. Okay, and in a two household environment, each of us have to become adequate or adept at all of the roles, which is a lot of pressure on us parents. Okay, because we're dealing with that. And so what I'm saying here, in a roundabout way, is even if your divorce is not a high conflict divorce, you're under more pressure than you think.
Right.
Okay, and that's why the children need their own advocate. Okay, so if you happen to miss some of these signs, the trained professional hopefully will not. Um, and It's better to catch these signs when they're younger than have them be poorly adjusted
Sure.
adults.
Very
And
well said.
one of the most powerful sayings most therapists and parents will tell you is, "Bigger kids, bigger problems."
Yeah.
So, so that's probably the most powerful advice I could give as a somebody who, if you're getting divorced, you have friends who are getting divorced, get their kids in therapy.
Yeah. That's
That's
that's a really, really
Yep.
wonderful point over there. And you talked a little bit about like, conflict or different things that could come up within the household. So when you're dealing with a two-parent household, or I'm sorry, a two-house parenthood, what would you say is the best way to go about child conflict, whether it's behaviors at school or whether it's physical changes or behaviors in general? Uh, how can the ex-spouses communicate with each other, and how can they deal with it in a way where it's not going to be hypocritical in the other household?
Okay. So, I keep introducing suggestions. Somebody might say that costs a lot of money, but I'll keep saying again, it's a lot more expensive if you don't do things right the first time. Um, there is a I could spend really 3 hours answering that question, and the answer to your question honestly differs based on how toxic the divorce is and how able or unable the parents are to communicate effectively. Communication is the key, though, to part of the answer to that question, because typically uh, these parents are not able to communicate optimally. So the best advice I can give you is to involve what's called a co-parent counselor, which is typically a therapist or a former therapist. Now, you can meet with a co-parent counselor irregularly or as needed. Could be once a month during the initial months of separation. Could be once every couple of weeks. So the way it worked for us is we found this person. She was great. Initially, it was almost once every 2 weeks. Then, as we became able to communicate a little bit better, once every month, once every 2 months, once a quarter, twice a year, and never. So it's a kind of an as needed thing. But the benefit of a co-parent counselor is that um, things you go in and you discuss things that are happening with the children. And then a very good co-parent counselor can take, okay, dad, what are you suggesting? Mom, what are you thinking? All right, hey guys, I've heard what you said. And you actually are 70% on the same page. And let's try to get it to 100% because we only have to talk about the 30%. Or you're not on the same page. Okay, we have to reach a compromise because you got to leave this room with a consensus. You can't have dad's house rules and mom's house rules. Okay, so and again, it's almost like a referee in a hockey game. All right, call and whistle, foul. All right, and I'm going to rule. Now, there's different types of these co-parent counselors. You can have one who is bind in. Okay, that's called a special master. And the benefit of that is it keeps you out of court. We talk about this more in the book. I know this is where I don't want to go here. We only have a limited amount of time, but a special master is great in super high conflict divorces. It allows the combatant former spouses to reach definitive answers. The special master, unlike the co-parent counselor, can force a decision, and it's done without going to court. So it's actually these things can typically do save you money. It might not feel that way because you're writing a check to somebody, but it keeps you out of court. And again, it allows you guys, allows the two household environment to parent effectively, and that's the number one thing, and where the kids benefit
Love
from
it.
that.
And I think this goes back also to what we were starting with before. Any living organism, not just human being in the world, has to have the concept of needing, of taking and receiving and also giving to society. From a plant needing to have the sun and the earth in order for it to grow better, to trees and animals and obviously humans. And I think the sooner parents are able to see, especially in a situation like this, where there could be high conflict and there could be long-term effects for the children and also for the two spouses. When you have the concept of, hey, I don't need to do this alone, I can get help, and there is help out there that I can work with, I think that goes a very, very long way regarding how the situation is going to pan out, just based on the fact of, hey, we need help over here. And when you have two people that they may not be able to live together, but they can agree that we have a common goal, and that is a four-letter word of KIDS. And when you look at it that way and you say, let's figure it out together, let's seek guidance from whoever that professional is, whether it's this uh, counselor, or whether it's going to be some sort of mediator or professional mediator in that sense, or a therapist, but outside of the family. But finding that in a way where it's going to be helpful to the whole situation, I think that's what we're talking about. And you said, I think the most important word that we did talk about here on this podcast of communication. And communication is key. And that being so important when it comes to how we deal with different situations, probably every single situation within the family dynamics. And this family dynamics is still there. It may be two different households, but the dynamic is still there because there is a common goal. And it's that four-letter word that we've been talking about. So I think that goes a very, very long way. When parents also want to be involved, though, in a certain way regarding the emotional needs of a child, but also, like you said, bringing in a therapist can be helpful as well. How can a parent go about approaching the emotional turmoil that might be going on within a child regarding the whole situation? Maybe, that other parent doesn't love me, or maybe there's something wrong with me, because a lot of children go through the stage of, this is my fault. How can a parent deal with that in a way where it's both, I want to call it therapeutically parenting apropos for the situation, but with a parent staying within their role?
The best thing the parent can do is, when we talked earlier about the need to find a children's therapist. All right. What I've learned in putting the book together is there's very, very, very different children's therapists in the types of therapy, as well as the commitment that these therapists have to adult communication. The big picture answer to your question is, don't trust yourself to do this, because you've got, as like I said earlier, you've got your own drama. So let's say you are in a high conflict divorce and you both agree to have a children's therapist. Not all children's therapists agree to speak to both parents in a high conflict divorce. So you also have to interview the children's therapist, not just, are you a good match for my kids or kid? You've also got to interview them and, okay, explain to me how you communicate with the two adults. Here's our situation. We don't really talk a lot. Or here's our situation. We talk a lot. It's not really kind. Or maybe in the best, we do co-parent somewhat effectively, and we can get on the phone together. We can sit in your office together, and you don't need to call a policeman. Okay, so you need to, when you speak to that therapist, explain honestly your situation with your ex, and ask that therapist what communication will you commit to so we can be informed. And you'll find a lot of differences, guys. And you got to make sure that the therapist's answer, irrespective of how well or how poor you are communicating with your ex, allows you both to get regular updates on the emotional needs of your children. So what I'm saying in a little roundabout way, there's a subset of children's therapists who do work with both parents in high conflict divorces. All right. You need to make sure if you are in a high conflict divorce that you're selecting a therapist who can get both of you the feedback if you have joint custody.
That's a good point. That's a very, very good point over there. So there's, I think, so much, I think, that we can continue to talk about in all these topics. And obviously, we're going to be recommending your book. And if I remember correctly, it's about over 40 different topics and tidbits that you talk about. And we'll obviously get into that. 46.
46.
Wow. That's a nice number over there. I'm curious also, let's say, when it comes to, because you started talking about the support that parents can have, and also for the kids as well. And just, going back to that for a second over here, when we talk about support within the family dynamic, and I'm talking about the extended family, whether it's, the parents' siblings or close friends, how can a parent go about creating boundaries within that for those people? Because I think sometimes, and most of us love our moms and we love our siblings, and we want to be able to continue to have a good relationship with them, and we also want to tell them to say, hey, stay there, and this is not for you, and this is not your role you're supposed to be playing right now. You shouldn't be giving your mommy advice. So what can a parent do? What can a mom or a dad do to sort of respectfully say, hey, know your place. You're not getting involved in whether it's the legal stuff or the children's stuff or anything else that might come up?
Sure. Well, this is actually a chapter in the book. I'm going to give you the cliff notes right now, Chananya. We talk about identifying who the advice givers are going to be. And my recommendation in the book is as a trained professional, a therapist, and you pick one person who had a similar circumstance and embodies where you want to land in 5 or 6 years. So if I'm a man, I pick a guy who's had a high conflict divorce and today who's landed in a great healthy place, who's raising his kids as an involved dad, and maybe has a nice new partner in his life. If a woman, same exact thing. Okay. A woman who had a similar level of conflict in her divorce, but today she's leading a good life and she did a great job of putting her kids first. 2 advice givers, a trained professional and one person who had similar circumstances, but today they're in a healthy place. Everybody else, you simply got to go to them and say whether, and this could be your parents. I got 2 rules. All right. I'll let you know when I want to talk about my drama and if I want to talk about my drama. Otherwise, I don't want to talk about it. Number 2, you're not allowed to talk about my drama in the presence of our kids. All right. I don't want them ever to hear a bad word out of your mouth about my former spouse in the
About
presence of
you?
my kids. So you've got to give, about
Right.
the ex primarily. So you've got to give these people who love you boundaries because they're going to want to talk about it. And one of the things I talk about in the book is people lose their jobs because they don't realize and find all they're doing is talking about their divorce. All right. So you don't want other parts of your life to collapse. But the bigger reason is that if you put some boundaries, and boundaries is the right word, the ones you used, if you put some boundaries around the people who love you about what they can and cannot say, that's going to be a massive gift for your children. All right. And it's also going to help you too, because you don't need to be talking about your divorce at all times. And you need to be restricting the conversations to your trusted confidant and you're capable therapist. That's it. That's it. Now, look, okay, yeah, you can talk about this or that, or maybe sometimes you get let off some steam. Okay, I'm okay with that, but don't have them initiating the conversation. All right.
That's a very good point, and I think that goes a very long way of making sure that those boundaries are up over there. One thing that you just brought up, and I'm happy you brought it up because I do have a question on that. When you talk about work and balancing the work and parenting life of a divorced mom or dad, I'm curious what sort of
Mhm.
advice you can give regarding creating that in a very healthy and conducive way. Just because of when there's a two-parent household, there's still a lot of juggling regarding working, regarding being home with your kids and spending time with them. But now there's a situation where there is only one person at home, and we'll ask separately regarding when one spouse gets remarried and the other one doesn't, and how to go about doing something like that within the children that they share together. But before that, when parents get divorced and they now have jobs and they also have a home to take care of and obviously children to be taken care of, how can we go about processing that out in a way that's going to be helpful and healthy for both each of the family households?
All right. So your question,
Ah,
the 25% of my book. 1/4 of the book are your needs as you navigate this process. And it is the part of the book, part of a divorcee's life that they pay the least attention to. And it's a brilliant question. You need to understand how different your world is. In the book, I think the chapter is called Light Switch Living. Let me explain what light switch living is like. So, kids are with you. All right. You got this big house. You got picking them up from school and helping with their homework and laughing, watching movies together. A lot of noise in the house. It's all really exciting. All right. And then, oh, they're with him or they're with her. The house is pretty depressing. And also the size of the home, it has to be big enough for them to be comfortable when they're with you, but it's way too big for a parent by his or herself. So there's no dimmer, all on or all off. And I realized as I put these chapters together and did a lot of interviews with experts to give their feedback, how massive this is, how big an issue is. That's this question. We could have an entire 5-hour podcast on it. Just this question, Shania. So just think about this for a second. Kids are not with you. All right. This is the night you play softball. This is the night you go out with the girls. This is the day you stay and you do that 12-hour day at work because you have an unencumbered schedule. But when the kids are with you and you have no partner to lean on, and that project is due at work, if you didn't get a head start on it when the kids were not with you, you're screwed, or you're doing it exhausted after you put your kids together at 11 to bed at 11 o'clock at night. The need to be able to manage the needs of your schedule. So your children's commitments you're there for them. Your professional commitments, you're there for your job because you don't want to be in the book. I talk about a guy who lost his job. He did not realize how his time was affected. He wasn't putting the time into his job, and he was talking about divorce to all of his colleagues. Again, boundaries. But back to this question this is a massive, massive issue. And we could be talking about this for 5 hours, just this issue. You have to take an inventory of your own schedule, your own time commitments for all of these different things, and make sure that the work has its time and your kids have their time. And the last thing I'm going to say about this point is this is so uneven. And this is an issue that many divorcees are not able to put their finger on. It is so uneven, Shania. Some days you're working 12, 13-hour work days. The next day you're working an 8-hour, you're going to clock out right away. All right. If you're an entrepreneur, you might have more flexibility to be picking up your kids, but you still got to budget your time. All right. I'm apologizing, guys. We are getting my house painted, but I hope you guys can still hear me.
We're
okay.
fine. We're fine. That's nothing to worry about over here. One last thing, because I know there are probably so many things that we can sort of go into over here, but we've been talking about your book a lot, and I want to give you a chance to talk about it a little bit. But I'm curious to start off the questions on your book over here. Um, what was the one or two things that through the research and of this book, and specifically through the book, and you talk about 46 different topics. What's the one or two things that really stood out to you that is not something that you were familiar with or you were aware of beforehand that like, oh, well, that's a really big deal and that's really important as you went on this journey of writing this book?
Wow. Well, it's a chapter in the book that when I wrote it, I'm like, it kind of feels hokey and maybe this doesn't belong. But in all the podcasts I've done by people who read the book first, it is the one chapter almost every podcast asks me about. And that's the answer to your question. It's called Put On Your Rubber Suit. And it's it's not a joke. It's every parent needs a coping mechanism to deal with maybe either a nasty former spouse or just things that are being said that really shouldn't be said. All right. And the rubber suit was a strategy that one dad used. So at a point in time, his custodial time was in her space. So he was staying with friends for 3 months while he got his funds and everything together to get his own place. So he would go into her space. That was his time with the kids. And it's the same thing applies tonight if you're just picking up your kids. And she was not aware, in his words, how rude and demeaning she was. So he put on this imaginary rubber suit and would walk in and everything would bounce off his rubber suit. All the insults, all the parenting criticisms. You're 5 minutes late. Boom, 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 boom. He would have a contest with himself. I wonder if I can hear something this time as he's about to walk in that beats last time's insult. He turned it into a game. But the point was every parent, man, woman, we need a mechanism in place for shielding ourselves from being affected. And this was a really, really powerful point. And again, it's one of the 46 tips. I'm like, well, should I go with 45 and leave this out? Whatever. It sounds a bit hokey. Every therapist, every podcaster, almost every one of them has asked about that chapter. And that's one of the things that we don't really realize that we sometimes don't realize the degree to which we're talking disrespectfully or we're being talked to disrespectfully. So on the talk to part, we all need a defense mechanism. So to help us be less affected by that. And that's what that chapter is talking about. And that was a really big realization. And that came from interviews with therapists and also a lot of the interviews I did with couples that went through the process that they said, you won't believe how rude he was to me or how evil she was to me. I just let it bounce off my chest. They had on a rubber suit.
In the therapeutic world, we have a word for something like that, the rubber suit. We would call it meditation and being mindful. So I think it goes a really long way to be able to find what is mindful and how you can go about being mindful. And when I talk about it in my practice, I don't like giving suggestions regarding books to read or people to listen to or podcasts or YouTube, because I believe it's so personable regarding what that mindfulness is going to be or what that rubber suit will look like for you. We could talk about the concept of what it is, like you were just talking about, but to give suggestions and say, this person, this app is what you should be doing before you walk into your ex-spouse's house. I'm not sure if that's going to be beneficial. It's about a person really finding what works for them. and really seeing that this is what I need and this is how I find myself. It could be stopping off at a fast food restaurant before you go to go pick up your kids and going to say, I'm going to eat a meal so I have a full stomach. So when
Yeah.
I go pick them up and I'm going to get bombarded with garbage,
Hmm.
it just doesn't do anything. You're going to run to Starbucks, get yourself a drink, whatever it is that a person can do. I think that's what you're saying basically, Andy, is find that thing that you need to do to be present, that you can have a coat of armor on you. So I think that's really some really really good advice over
Yeah.
there. And just to sort of, as we're
Thank you.
wrapping it up over here, we've talked so much. Well, all the questions have been really, I feel like I'm batting almost 1,000 over here with topics that end up being in your book. But I'm curious, there are certain things that you normally talk about that didn't come up today that are usually in your book that you want to talk about for a minute or two here.
Well, we talk a lot about going through the process, assessing if divorce is the right path. So even if you're in a troubled relationship, the book is good. Kind of helps you identify, is my marriage broken, or is it stale? Um, there's a lot of negotiation tips that help you. Um, the one thing I would identify that we really didn't talk about is um, the 46 tips and strategies are focused on unilateral steps. This is a really important point because you can't control him,
Beautiful.
you can't control her. You probably couldn't when you lived under one house. You're not going to be able to in two households. So the counsel is based on things that we can do to manage challenges we're getting on the other side. All right. Or from our former spouse. But the steps that we take and the strategies that we will use, many of them are designed to eventually result in a change of behavior. But the steps have to be focused on unilateral counsel. And in fact, I think it's the first chapter in the book, so that the reader understands that that's intentional counsel. Um, and that you're a therapist, you know this. You can only give advice to the person who's sitting opposite you. But how that person can deal with their life issues, you give counsel that hopefully can help the life issues to solve themselves. But the only person that can be controlled is the person in your room. Same thing. The reader is the only one who can make strategic steps and adjustments. But again, some of these steps are designed to improve the working relationship or co-parenting relationship. But by starting with things that you
Beautiful.
can
I love
control,
that.
which
And
is
the way
yourself.
I like referring to that in my practices, and the way I would talk about it when you're buying and then reading your book, Andy, is make a U-turn when you're reading it. It's sort of like, go inside and say, this book is about you. It's
Yeah.
not about, okay, what tactics can I use the next time, we're in negotiations or we're in mediation or we're in front of a judge. It's not about that. It's about what can I do right here, right now with me that I have control over. And I think that's such a beautiful point over here. I like ending and some, I guess you could say, rapid fire questions over here. But before we get to rapid fire questions, I'm curious if there's, we talked a lot about your experience and how you've dealt with your kids. Is there a funny or embarrassing or hysterical story that you don't mind sharing with us regarding how this process has gone, or maybe in general, even before this process even started, uh, in like 1 or 2 minutes, like a really fast story that happened with your kids?
I'll give you a great one super fast. So when I split up, my kids were on a gluten-free diet, nut-free, and lactose intolerant. My ex was a great cook. So I'm having to learn how to cook with those restrictions. Let's just say it was horrible. I bought a bunch of books though. I rolled up my sleeves. A friend of mine gave me this cookbook. And I actually like, this recipe looks kind of simple. And I actually brought the kids in the kitchen. I had them help me. And they were always saying, Dad, your cooking sucks. So this meal they liked. So like, this is the first time I've cooked something that they liked. And it was a really simple dish. And they helped me in the kitchen. So I called my friend and I said, you wouldn't believe it. The cookbook you gave me was great. It was helpful. The kids even helped me cook and they loved the meal. She's like, and when you're getting divorced, you don't pay attention to everything because your whole world's in turmoil. And she laughed. She said, Andy, you goofball. The book's a children's cookbook. Of course it's simple. I did it. I forgot on the cover it said things you're supposed to cook with your
That's
kids
amazing.
that are super simple. One of the ingredients was ketchup and mustard and honey is like, oh my God. So anyhow, I had a really great laugh at my own expense. One of many, Shania.
That's
So that's a
awesome.
cute story. But
Yeah,
it's also
that's
kind of
great.
a
And
story of
I think there are so
perseverance.
many
Yeah.
stories that come up that are specifically around food, and I think that's such a great one. I'm curious if there would be a
Yeah.
book or maybe a podcast or a person of interest that you would recommend people try to follow or listen or read. What would you recommend? Cannot be your own.
All right. Well, the most funny, I just bought this book for my son who's 16. Um, Probably one of the most moving books I ever read, Shania, was Tuesdays with Morrie by Mitch Albom. It's just how do you write an uplifting book when you talk about a
Yeah.
man
Oh
who's
man.
dying from ALS disease? And this book
Oh yeah.
is just so powerful. I mean, there's three books I recommend to anybody that I mentor, and that's one of the three.
That's awesome.
And
I
that's the
love
one
it.
book
Thank
I
you for
would
saying
recommend.
that. It's something that as my kids go into grade school, it's something that I've contemplated what the right age is for them to start reading that. And I think as they're whether there might be death in family or a loved one, and the concept of sickness, and you could really cherish relationships and a sort of healthy, really positive outlook in life. I think it's absolutely one of the best books out there. So thank you for recommending that. And obviously, we're going to post that, and we're going to post a link to your book as well. My last question for you is: if you can have a superpower, but a mundane superpower that would assist in your parenting, what would that be?
Superpower would be to be able to look 5 minutes later to see how what I plan to do with parenting actually landed. So if I planned to do something stupid, I wouldn't do it. That would be the most amazing parental superpower on the planet. Because so many times with kids, I'm an old guy, and my upbringing, my thoughts are wired like an old guy's. But kids today, they're different. They're just
Yeah,
in 30-second tidbits. So, like with my daughter, I finally figured out, and she's 18 in college, I got to get what I want to say out of my mouth in 2 or 3 sentences. Because otherwise,
she's
once I hit
lost.
3 sentences, I've been to
Got it.
the video
That's
shut off.
awesome. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. And where can people find you if they want to get more information about you, and where can they buy your book?
Sure. Well, you can contact me by getting the book. I have a website, but so the book, this is it, guys. Take the High Road: Divorce with Compassion for Yourself and Your Family. You can get on Amazon. And what I would say to you guys, if I sound like I make sense, I can help people. So what this is not my job, guys. I got a great career. I wrote this book because I saw a gap in the divorce book space. As a businessman, I felt I could put together a best practices manual essentially for getting divorced. It's a 2 or 3 hour read. If you know someone who is troubled, a great therapist like Shania who could use this for his or her patients. Yeah, somebody who has been divorced and they're having trouble co-parenting. Do them a favor and get this book. And if you get it for yourself and I help you, please post a review on Amazon. I am so humbled, Shania. My book is new. I've got almost 100
Amazing.
reviews, and they're I think all but one is 5 stars. I think I've created something that can really help people. And that's why I wrote the book. I know it sounds corny, guys. I'm not looking for a new career to become a divorce guru, whatever. I'm trying to give back because I think I can help people because some of these divorce books are written by attorneys from attorneys' perspective, from a therapist perspective, from a co-parent counselor, from their perspective. So like, all right, I'm going to take all the great advice from all of these experts because most divorcees don't have the time to read 5, 10 books and put together in one simple read with 46 tips and strategies of which most divorcees are likely to be dealing with
From a dad's
at least
perspective. So
two thirds of them.
that's
So
amazing. Well,
that's Well, no, I will say this. My book is absolutely, I wrote it as a male. I put my pants on in the morning, but it's absolutely written. The advice
Awesome.
is completely unisex. And I've gotten such amazing feedback from women who read the book and said, you know what? This is a great way for me to better manage my ex. These are things I can do myself that can, because I'm having a very challenging divorce. So yeah, so it's written by a man, but I would say it's
Right.
equally
I think it's coming
beneficial
from
to both
firsthand
genders.
experience and not from that professional point of view, which I think is refreshing and very needed. And so glad we had an opportunity to talk about it today. Andy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Hey again. I hope you were able to learn as much as I did today. Thank you so much for staying to the end and listening to the entire interview. Please feel free to leave a comment wherever you listen to this podcast. All comments will be read weekly, and we appreciate all feedback and ideas. If you have an idea for a guest or a specific topic, please feel free to share. Additionally, you can contact us at parentingiseasypodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's parentingiseasypodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for joining today, and remember, parenting is a journey. Don't forget to enjoy it. The goal is to be a little better today than yesterday, and hopefully better tomorrow than we were today.